Okay, so hello, good morning, and good afternoon for people that they are actually overseas. Welcome to CMS first presentation. Actually, these are two lecture series. One that we have designed for CMS. One it's called Visionary Lecture Series that provides a venue for prominent scholars to present new ideas and projects related to the Maghreb. And that will be like annual. And this one that is called CMS, it's by members only, but open to the public, CMS members work in progress lectures. And this was actually suggested by our esteemed colleague and member of CMS, who kindly accepted my invitation to give the first presentation. Just to let you know that, because I will not have time or I will forget by the end of the lecture, the second lecture will be presented by another wonderful colleague and director of ASU Libraries, Jim O'Donnell. He will be speaking on Saint Augustine and the creation of the Maghreb, and I think that will be by 16th of April. I just give you a small, short bio of Dr. Charles Redman. He's a wonderful and a valuable member of CMS. He has been committed to interdisciplinary research since he was a graduate student. He worked closely in the field with botanists, zoologists, geologists, art historians, and ethnographers. Dr. Redman received his BA from Harvard University and his MA and PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago. He taught at New York University before coming to Arizona State University in 1983. Since then, he served 9 years as chair of the Department of Anthropology, 7 years as director of the Center for Environmental Studies, and in 2004, he was chosen to be the Julie Ann Wrigley Director of the newly formed Global Institute of Sustainability. Dr. Redman's interests include human impacts on the environment, rapidly urbanizing regions, urban ecology, environmental education, and public outreach. He is the author and co-author of 6 books, including a book about Morocco, entitled Qsar Es-Seghir, an archaeological view of medieval life, first published in 1986 by Academy Press. For more information, please visit ASU website. So for the format, everybody is going to be muted, but I have 2 colleagues that are going to help me take your questions at the end of the lecture. I think Salah will be volunteered to read the questions, and then right, Salah, yeah, and then and Dr. Redman will be answering them. So thank you for being here. Go ahead, Dr. Redman.
Thank you, Juki, very much for the kind introduction and for arranging this. I'm particularly proud to be the initial speaker in this series because I think the Center for Maghrebi Studies will grow and become a very important entity here at ASU and nationally and internationally, I hope, and will reflect well on the Maghreb in general. I'm an archaeologist by training, and today's talk is archaeology, and I know many of you are in all different disciplines, and that's part of the excitement of CMS, is that we are coming from all different perspectives, looking at the same reality of the people and part of the world, and hopefully by seeing it in different ways, we'll all learn from each other. I'm going to share a screen, and hopefully, let's see how that works. Okay, here's actually a map from 1727 of the Straits of Gibraltar. And if you can follow my arrow, although the archaeological site I excavated at had been abandoned for 150 years, it was important enough that it's mentioned right here, Al-Qsar, midway between Tangiers and Ceuta on the Moroccan shores of the Straits of Gibraltar. Oh, this is not going to work. You're going to have to let me share a different screen. Okay, that's better. But let me make it larger. Okay. I came to Morocco and to Qsar Es-Seghir in 1972, a long time ago. It is a site that was known, as the map from the 1720s shows, for all times, but hadn't been the subject of any systematic research up until then. I arrived interested in Morocco, in early cities, in Islamic culture cities, and Morocco was a particularly promising area, and I had the good fortune of having a large grant from the U.S. Smithsonian Institution. And I came with that and met with Moroccan officials in the Ministry of Culture. They didn't have an archaeological service at that time, though it was soon to begin while we were working there. And it was actually suggested that we work at Qsar Es-Seghir. It was a very out of the way place. It had a dominant geography in the Middle Ages, but after its abandonment in 1550, it became what I would call a sleepy village, a little bit of fishing traffic, a little bit of smuggling, but not much activity until we arrived there to do archaeology. However, Qsar Es-Seghir reemerged in the early 2000s and became the location of an international container freight port. And the concept was, and you see this picture down here of ships waiting in line, the concept was to take containers that would be trucked from all over Africa and put them on boats that would either go to North America or the rest of the Mediterranean or through the Suez Canal to Asia, and become a sort of skipping off point for international global trade. This was pretty exciting because it sort of was reminiscent of a stepping off point from North Africa into Europe in the medieval age. And so there was a certain reminiscence. The other aspect of this port being created there is it meant that a super highway was built to the location. So what took us 40 minutes on a gravel road from the nearest city now could be reached by a 4-lane expressway from Casablanca and beyond. It also meant that there was substantial investment in the area. And so in 2011, the Moroccan government decided to open the site for tourism. And along with that was a symposium that they held that I was invited to, where people who had something to do with Qsar Es-Seghir in history or in the past came to share ideas and to celebrate the opening of this tourist site. And what you're looking at here is actually standing walls today that were built during the Portuguese occupation to allow ships that were still in the water to unload their goods and people in a sheltered walkway that led up to the fort. If you can see this slide very well, that is the Rock of Gibraltar right there. And so we are 22 kilometers from Tarifa in Spain. That's the shortest crossing of the Straits of Gibraltar. It's more like about 80 kilometers to Gibraltar at an angle to cross there. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the history of the site before I show you things we found and what we thought about it. In the textual record, it is implied that Tariq in his initial, I wouldn't call them invasions, the forays or raiding parties from Morocco into Spain in 711, embarked from a place called Qsar Masmuda, Masmuda being the local Berber tribe of the area. And most historians imply that this is Qsar Es-Seghir in an earlier version. We know more about it in Almoravid times, but it's really with the Almohads that Qsar Es-Seghir is clearly identified. It's clearly described and real constructions going on there. And in fact, Abu Yusuf, the the emir known as Al-Mansur, who built many of great monuments across the Maghrib, was said to have fortified this site and to have spent weeks on end before several invasions of Spain that he led. And these weren't really invasions, they were more pacification efforts to keep everyone in order under the Almohad Empire. Probably the most apparent construction period that we found is Marinid, the following dynasty, and I'm giving very rough dates, 1200 AD, where Abu Yusuf Yaqub, not the same man, but the repeated name, conducted 4 different invasions of Spain, more or less to pacify some of the upstart Muslim leaders, and also to ensure that the Christian Reconquista was not successful, and they did quite well. And during the Marinid time, we believe the fortifications we see today and the gates were constructed, and it was renamed Qsar el-Majaz, the Castle of the Crossing. In roughly 1300, the Marinids suffered a defeat in Spain and ceased to become an active force, and the Muslim states of Iberia were on their own from that point forward. But Sarsir probably flourished even more at that time and took on the name that we call it now, and that the maps, like the later map, know it from, which is small fortress. And I think of it more as a town or small city at that point. Things stayed this way until the mid 1400s, when Prince Henry the Navigator was convincing Portuguese royalty that they should support navigations away from Europe. And among those first were in the near Atlantic and in the coast of North Africa. And actually, in 1415, we acknowledged the Portuguese conquest of Ceuta to be probably the first European colony outside of Europe. In 1458, Henry the Navigator and the king at that time, Alfonso V, brought 300 ships. I don't know why they needed so many, to Sarsir, which is quite a small fortress, disembarked near it, and the fortress surrendered after 3 days of siege. And this became a Portuguese fort. They refortified it. They redesigned the fortifications against cannon fire versus crossbow fire, and renamed it Qsar Es-Seghir. And on many of the later maps recounting its location, this is the name that's used for it. The Portuguese, and I'll talk a lot more about it in a few minutes, occupied this fort and really converted it into a colony with families and wives as well as soldiers for about 100 years, until the Pope more or less split up the world between Portugal and Spain, and Sarsir fell in the Spanish part and Brazil fell in the Portuguese part. And so they abandoned most of their North African sites at that time. And there's been very little resettlement of the area until recent times. Well, what's our story? As I told you, I came to Morocco to investigate early medieval urban sites with funding from the American Smithsonian Institution. And actually it was the Moroccan government, the official that I met in the Ministry of Culture, who suggested Sarsir for excavation, and had a map that had been created about 10 or 15 years earlier of the visible remains, and had used the transliteration of Qsar with a Q, and that became the one we adopted because it had come from the government. But now we find there's lots of different ways that people transliterate the name of the site. We were very immersed in what we thought of as new archaeology at the time, a sort of scientific approach that brought in ethnographers and historians and art historians, as well as archaeologists and botanists and zoologists. And so we brought all that together. We were applying computer approaches. We were recovering all the artifacts that possible. We were introducing what to our colleagues was a very modern approach to archaeology. And I think the Moroccans involved at the time were very excited, number one, to have someone other than from France coming. I have to tell you that. French was still the second, if not the first language of the Moroccan government at that time. But they were very anxious not to have to rely on French individuals for everything. And so there were a number of French projects going on in Morocco, and they very enthusiastically welcomed the idea of another government in another country to work in Morocco. And so they were very cooperative in getting things going for us. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this archaeological approach, and then and a few of you may be particularly interested in that. And then I'll go on to show you lots of things we found there. The dark line is something we were able to ascertain after several seasons of work there, but they reflected the visible and still buried fortification walls, and it's about 200 meters across, so no more than 1,000 people probably lived inside this fortress at any time. And the fortress, we ultimately discovered, had 3 visible gates. We also think there was an entryway for, there's a river along here, for river traffic into the city from here. But these would be the ceremonial gates, and this, clearly the largest, most elaborate gate, probably was ceremonial in terms of embarkations to Spain. And when the rulers of the Almohad and Marinid dynasties were there, they probably went in and out of this gate. This was a big gate that would go towards Septa, the largest city near it. And this small gate right down here was probably the one most of the people went through, because farmlands were here. And this led ultimately in the direction of Fez, the imperial capital, and even beyond to Marrakesh, which would have been also a capital at that time. The dark dots, and this was quite innovative at the time, is sort of a checkerboard of areas we excavated in order to give us what we call a representative idea of what went on in the city. And each of these were 10 meters on a side, so they allowed you, and you'll see lots of pictures of these in a minute, allowed you to get a vision of what was underground there, and there were houses and streets and central institutions. When we found something interesting, we often expanded beyond those 10-meter squares, and so this whole area we'll call units expanded based on judgment. That is, these were interesting things, and I'll show you. In this square we started, and we found what we ultimately determined was the hammam for the city, and that led us to want to expand the area, which then this one actually had part of the mosque, the congregational mosque from the city, and so we expanded the entire building around here. This is a portrayal. We spent 6 seasons of between 5 weeks and 6 months in Morocco working at this site. We set up the project in 1972. The first actual excavations were in 1974. I have to tell you that in 1973, I and a small group of archaeologists arrived thinking we were going to work at the site, and a new minister of culture and also of the Habub was initiated, and he was in charge of all things religious, and he was quite conservative and felt that anything that happened before the modern era wasn't of interest to anyone. And so he didn't want to see any kind of historic monument work or whatever. So we actually came back, and once again we were in favor in 1974, and everyone was happy to have us. So we started work and worked each of the next years, alternate years, on through 1981. The important thing here is we spent a fair amount of energy outlining the site, understanding the fortifications, lots of energy uncovering the major monuments, but also exploring the entire site. But by the 4th season, we had completed all those squares and put all of our energy into uncovering monuments and entire houses and things like that. Well, what about I'm going to divide what I show you basically in two parts. This first part are lower down. Remember, this is archaeology where the most recent things are at the surface, and the deeper you dig, the older it is. So the deeper we dug, the farther back we went. So when we first put our shovels and trowels in the ground, everything we found was from that last century of Portuguese occupation. Once we excavated and recorded that, we removed much of that. And underneath it were levels that were left by the Islamic community from the 12th and 13th century primarily, but I expect some of these remains much deeper in the site were probably even earlier from the Almoravid period in the 10th and 11th century. What dominates here is the Straits of Gibraltar, a river, a outcrop that made a natural harbor, so it was a logical place to anchor ships and easy access to the interior through this river valley. And so it became a natural place where you would both fortify against people. But this was, until the Portuguese came, this was never challenged by a foreign military authority. This was always pointed the other way, where it was a town and a fort where people would gather to leave North Africa in order to pacify or reconquer areas in Iberia. And so, as I mentioned, these are the three major gate complexes. This is the location of the large mosque. This is the hammam. We believe this is the marketplace, the souk, and I'll show you why. And then over the rest of this are mainly houses, and they're quite elaborate and lovely houses, and I'll show you pictures and describe them a little bit more. But the important thing to me is we feel that we identified what classical scholars identify as the three key institutions of the Islamic city of the Middle East and North Africa: the mosque, the hammam, and the souk. And so in some classic way, it never had an enormous population, but because of its political and military importance, it always was considered a real town or even city. Well, here's some actual views. These are plans. If you're not used to art history or architectural history, these are looking down 100%. Here is the Monumental Gate. And what's wonderful about it is it has a double bent access entry into the city. The interior of the city is here, which gives a major military opportunity to defend the entrance because there are gates here and you have fortified towers here to throw boiling oil and rocks on the invaders. And then they have to turn, they can't keep just going straight in, and then they stop and they have to turn again. And so battering rams and things like that would be very hard to navigate. So this is like a classic but hugely effective entryway in medieval times. As I said, I don't think they ever had to defend the city through it because their defense was the Navy, and the Almohad and Almoravid and the Marinid navies dominated the Straits of Gibraltar until 1300. This is the secondary gate, the gate pointed to the east toward Ceuta, or Septa as it's known. It's once again a double bent access entryway. It's not quite as large as the more ceremonial sea gate. Similar idea. Once again, even the small Fez gate is a double bent access, but of a much smaller scale. This is the Bab el-Bahar, the ceremonial sea gate right here. What you see around it is actually Portuguese fortifications. When they conquered the town, they took this strong point and they refortified it with a totally different system of fortifications that I'll show you in a few minutes. This picture down here is actually down in the Fez Gate. Right here, there was an inscribed tablet, and it was quite fun. That's me. We had some local, what you would call elders. I hate to use the word wise men, but they were the local wise men who were coming to read this inscription, which is now the Moroccan government has this plaque. Here's a picture head on, and right here is what the level the dirt had accumulated was. We excavated it, and so there's dirt about this high up across this whole area. These are these two defensive towers here and here. What's wonderful about this is it's an elaborately decorated in brickwork and stucco entranceway. And here's some close-ups just to give you an idea. The actual gate with a horseshoe entryway was here in brick and plaster. These floor things, a fleur-de-lis design inside. We uncovered this that had never been seen before since abandonment 500 years ago, this plaster, painted plaster relief. The gate is way below us here. We're standing way up in the air. The Gentry Gate, Portuguese actually filled in and placed cannons on the top of, because it was probably the dominant location to defend things from. The mosque is quite wonderful. It's a largest building, perhaps best seen from the architectural drawing we made of it. Here is the Qibla Wall. The mihrab is right here, a niche for a minbar stairway, and sort of some supporting material is right here next to it. Some remaining columns. There were 5 aisles facing the Qibla Wall, with the main aisle being slightly wider, with horseshoe arches supporting the roof in this enormous room. If you've ever been to the mosque in Cordoba, the Grand Mosque, which is quite spectacular and larger than this, but the idea would be the same, the sort of decorative motif of the horseshoe arches between each of the aisles and over the entire roofed area would have been similar. What's interesting is there's an open courtyard, and all of this building would have been floored in what you'll see more of right here is a herringbone brick design. So it was a brick flooring. When the Portuguese conquered Qsar Es-Seghir in 1458 and soon thereafter, they converted the mosque into their main church, and I'll show you drawings of it as a church. But in the picture here, you'll see that there isn't a brick floor anymore, but there's all these big stone slabs, and these were actually the reflooring of the mosque into a church. And underneath most of these are burials that I'll show you pictures of their inscriptions and burials when we talk about the Portuguese settlement. There's an interesting thing going on right here. This is the mihrab that people would have faced toward, and this is where the stairway minbar would have gone up in the main room to a higher element. There is a small opening between the minbar and the mihrab area. And remember, there's a stairway in front, so you can't see what goes on underneath the stairway if you're in the mosque. It's posited by historians that many mosques had sort of an emergency exit in case a very important one. In this case, the emir, the ruler of the empire, would be here on several occasions. And so he probably took his seat very near the proceedings, but he also could escape through here and out the back door if there was any kind of threat to him. The hammam, or public bath, this is a beautifully preserved building, actually. It was all buried underground, and only the top few stones were even visible on the surface. But it was obvious right away that it was an elaborate building because the brick and stone walls were all plastered and painted, both in just red wainscot in the lower area, but then sort of floral motifs in red on white plaster in the upper areas. It had 3 main rooms. Here's a drawing of it. And it had an entry sort of courtyard that you would enter from here into and probably sit, and there was a fountain in the center of it and small rooms on each side. And actually what we believe was a toilet right here. And it's sort of important to note in the Islamic city that virtually every building had its own toilet with central plumbing that led out to a sewer under the main street. That's not an activity in the Portuguese period. They used chamber pots and had very poor central plumbing. But nevertheless, this was this entry courtyard. You had a cold room, a tepid room, a warm room, the caldarium. In the tepid room, there were 4 what we interpreted as changing niches right here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. In this cold room, this was all roofed over with barrel vaults. And then you would be in the warm room and spend time there, and then go into the hot room. And the floor in the hot room was raised in a sort of hyper-style system of columns that held the floor up, because back outside the hot room was actually a furnace that was quite obvious, and it gave immediate access under the floor of the hot room. So all of the classic features of a both medieval and modern day hammam were here. A support room right next to it, a large room with a water wheel well that could provide major quantities of water for the hammam that would be passed through here, but also provided water for clay use, and a pottery kiln was here. And so not only did you have the furnace and water wheel supplying water and fire for hammam, but you had the water wheel and an underground kiln for pottery production right here. Here is the furnace, and this is underneath the level of the floor of the hammam as well up here, and you'd be able to blow air under the floor here, and then you would pass it through. That we were looking is right there into this large room where a water wheel well, all this was buried when we came and we uncovered it, would provide large quantities of water. And then we found this lower into the ground kiln, and all the bricks are burned red, and there would have been an arched roof over it, and it could produce large quantities of pottery. Now this is what we call the souk, and I identified it that way largely because in a very short area right here, here, and here were 3 very large domed ovens. You can sort of begin to see the beehive shape of the oven, the opening here, very familiar from modern, but yet traditional ovens that you would find today in restaurants or souks, where bread is being made, fire is being put in the back, and when it turns to ash and charcoal, to push it to the back of the domed oven. This is covered over in a dome with an opening here. Then you'd put bread in, not unlike putting pizza in a pizza oven today, but these were beehive dome ovens. And you can see not only did you have them right in a row, but the street that you were on had a sort of low curb before the front walls of the building, which would act like a sidewalk, which made a lot of sense in a souk type area. Now, these are the major identifiers of an Islamic city. And here you are in the far Maghrib in a small town, and still you had the major elements that define Islam in operation there. For me, in fact, the Islamic houses were by far the most interesting. They were diverse. We think they represented people of different wealth and time. This is one of the lower ones, perhaps Almohad period. All this tiling, 2 side rooms that are probably with wooden floors. They are dirt now. This central tile is quite amazing, an elaborate design with a well in the center that could have provided water for a fountain, but certainly water for use of the people in the house. This is the entryway, which is here in the drawing. There's a street here, and what's interesting to me is this. I love it's a beautiful house, and actually when we built our home in Arizona soon after we had discovered this house, we gave the architect this plan, and hopefully he could incorporate some of the aspects of this design into our house, which he did. But an important aspect is, number one, the street is dirt. Even though it has underground plumbing that's very advanced, the effort is not to pave the street like you'll see in the Portuguese period. The wall on the street is very plain, not painted, just stone and brick and covered over with mud. And when you entered the doorway, you saw another wall right away. And even if you got in and turned this way, you saw another wall. Even in a private house, you had a bent axis entryway to more or less protect the privacy of the home, which would be here. And I assume this is the work areas or living rooms further back. And actually there could have been workrooms out the back door here in the side area over here. The other aspect is you had this uncovered central patio, and a drain out of it that went through this way and out here and into the street. And this very much, I think, is strongly identifiable as a toilet inside the house, indoor plumbing. You'd stand here, you had water running under it and out of the house. This is probably 1100 AD, and we're talking advanced plumbing that George Washington didn't have in Mount Vernon. These are some other Islamic houses we found. A little bit harder to tell what's going on because they are directly under the Portuguese level. And when the Portuguese, we think when they first came, reused some of these houses, redesigning where the walls were, and then beat them up and design their own houses on top of it. But once again, there's always this central courtyard. In this case, there's a more elaborate design in the centerpiece here with glazed tiles. We think it's probably a Marinid or late Marinid Saadian house after the major construction period of the monuments of the site. And what you can see is each house has a central courtyard. It has a well providing water. It has an access way here, not double bent access, but a bent access to get into the house. In this case, a stairway, which we think led to a second floor around the building. And here you can see two more designs of Islamic houses. In this case, a much smaller house with an entryway here, a toilet with a very small courtyard right here with a well in it, a couple of living rooms. And then once again, what we think may have been a stairway up above into the second floor. What's fun about these other buildings is we begin to see some really elaborate tile work. Here is a third building I don't have a drawing of for you, but the central courtyard not only has this open area with small black tiles and larger red tiles in a herringbone pattern, but it has this sort of motif of green and white glazed tiles surrounding it, and then once again a herringbone pattern in the surrounding rooms. Here is a door threshold that has a very classic star-like design that you've seen. You can see in mosques in Fez, multiple colored tiles in larger stars that interlocked with each other, and then a door jamb on each end. And this was preserved because the door had been filled up by the Portuguese, so it preserved the decoration there. We excavate a lot of dirt when we uncover these things, and in a lot of dirt are broken pieces of pottery and tools and jewelry and coins and things that help tell us what went on there. And here's a sampling that we found tens of thousands of pieces of pottery. A large part of our effort would be to catalog them and try to discuss how old they suggest the levels were, what areas that if the pots weren't made. We actually think some of these pots, particularly these black on brown pots, were made in that pottery kiln area that I showed you before. But other pots, we think this plate, heavily eroded but quite elaborate, probably was made in Egypt in the Fatimid times and traded into Qsar Es-Seghir. This pot is what we would later call Majolica, probably from Valencia in Spain, and brought here during the time when Valencia and Qsar Es-Seghir were all part of one state. Some of these others we think might have been Almohad, more local production. Some resist pottery may have been brought in from Fez. All of these things, this is a very large pot that may have stored, cooking oil or something like that. There's some pretty things, and these are some summary pictures just to let you know what they look like. Kinds of jewelry, hollow pieces you'd wear around your neck and probably put a piece of parchment with a small inscription from the Quran in here. Once again, this is gold plated. It's made of copper, actually bronze. All of these are bronze pieces. This is silver plated. These are not really rich people. These are semi-rich people. This is gold plated. This is this actually has gold and some semi-precious stones in it. These are centimeters, so 2.5 of these is an inch. So all of these are small pendants, all 5 of these. This is a big belt buckle, probably a military belt with an inscription, "God is great" on it, not a surprising one. And you can see the belt would have probably been leather and gone out this way, and the tong that held the buckle together that's missing is here. These are some of the spectacular coins. Only these 3 are from the Islamic level, but quite surprising and happily that we did find 1 gold coin in the debris, and it is probably an Almohad coin from the Islamic levels. 2 silver coins. We think this one may have been Almoravid, and this one may have been Marinid one. These others are Portuguese coins, and I'll show you more of those later. So that's sort of a summary of the Islamic city as we saw it. Remember, now built directly on top of the Islamic city that was abandoned in 1458, peaceably left. That is, the Muslims who lived in Qsar Es-Seghir surrendered, and the Portuguese left them leave peaceably, even carrying their arms with them. And so an empty city was available to the garrison that the Portuguese king left there. He said he left the garrison, and it was reinforced later, and later colonists came. And so here is once again the fortification. The Arab walls were used again, but the entryway gates were refortified substantially and built in a different way. The other aspect that was different is the Islamic city walls were quite high. We think they were over 10 meters high, and not very thick, but they were built in the 1200s against crossbows and very rare use of cannons at that time. And so that wasn't a primary concern. 1458, cannons were a primary concern. And so when the Portuguese came, there's one reason why they were able to capture the city so easily, is they were well equipped with cannons. But they rebuilt the walls with sloping glacis, that is, sloping embankments against the lower half of the walls, so that if a cannonball came against the lower half of the wall, it would probably just bounce off of this slope embankment. And the upper half was vulnerable, but it was already the upper half. And then there was a moat built around the city, all the way around the city, which made it more difficult to surmount this area with ladders. The Portuguese fort, unlike the Islamic fort, did come under attack numerous times in the first 50 years they were there. The emir and Fez, the local rulers, the governor of Septa, they all launched attacks on the Portuguese fort, but the Portuguese fort was threatened but able to defend themselves against them. These major fortifications they added were effective, and they had cannonades and placed on all these embankments. So you have a very different fortification system. This is the main citadel, and I'll show you pictures of it. And this is the Karacha, the covered passageway that I showed you at the beginning, the cover picture going out to the Straits of Gibraltar in Spain. But you could land ships here far from the fort and then bring goods in this way. And hopefully these ships could defend themselves with their own cannons. And then the more normal way into the fort, we now know there's a modern archaeological expedition working with the Moroccans on the site today. And the Moroccan team has largely uncovered this whole area of fortifications during the last 10 years. And the Portuguese archaeologists who've been working have been largely focused on this small entry into the city that probably was used for everyday commerce up the river and here, but would be vulnerable to attacks from the land. And so this was used probably during any time they were attacked. The other aspect of the Portuguese town that we'll see is really what we interpret as the main street that led between the 2 large citadels and a large plaza area that would be sort of, we think, the ceremonial center, with the mosque now the main church, a building that doesn't have an Islamic equivalent that we call the assembly hall. The hammam of Muslim times, we think the Portuguese converted into a prison, and a sort of set of different kinds of houses and a secondary church and things like that. Oh, by the way, this was found before we came, it was in the Tetuan museum, and in the 50s someone had come, and I done some excavation, not very serious archaeology, but they did find it, one of these gravestones that was from the church flooring, that underneath I'm sure were burials, though they didn't excavate any of those. We're inside the main citadel, looking actually at this wall right here. And as you can see now, we're talking probably 20 or 25 meters tall. This is our excavating team. This happens to be a team when I brought a field school from the United States with, so there were about 20 foreigners and about 50 Moroccan workers, largely from the local villages, who came here to work. And these were the inside of the defensive walls, gun emplacements where cannons would be both on the ground level and up higher. And then there was a parapet around here with probably rifle holes and some small cannon holes that would defend themselves against attack. You can see the excavation's a big job. We unearthed and removed hundreds of cubic meters of dirt in order to find all of these things. Here's a melange of different pictures. The end of the covered passageway looking out toward the Straits of Gibraltar, the central plaza with the prison here, the main church over here, standing in the market area over here would have been what we called the assembly hall. This is in the second larger gate. There's citadel around it, but what's interesting here is there's a moat here, and there would have been a drawbridge across it. Inside the city is here. All this was underground when we came, but we excavated. And here you'll see the grooves for the metal dropping portcullis, that sort of a metal gate that would fall in. Inside that metal gate, you could see sort of axle bases where the big wooden doors would be placed, and they would turn inside and probably outside doors as well, and a drawbridge here. So these were really strong emplacements. Right inside this gate was a series of 3 more or less troughs that we think were for watering horses. And so this probably was the main in and out way of the town. This is where you'd bring your horses. And here is the church, the remade mosque. Lots of stone slabs reflecting sort of the gravestones. The mihrab has been filled in right here. The minbar niche that there would have been a stairway has been replaced by a big altar right here. There's a painted altar here with a stairway up to it. In the Qibla wall was broken through here, and a large altar chapel was built here with a small altar there and a chapel here. And you can look down in this chapel, and the altar's here. And the flooring is fancy sort of red tile with a colorful Valencia tile pattern in it here. Actually, these are probably from Seville, not Valencia. And here you can see the remade, all of the colonnade has been broken down. The far left aisle has been converted into a series of chapels. And I think I have a picture of a couple of those, with each with their own altar, and probably the governor and if there are any elite families, each have their own family here. Here you can see these chapels. Here's 3 of them in a row. One, we have a conservator from Pennsylvania, actually from the University of Pennsylvania, came here, and she's sort of injecting preservative into this plaster painting, and you can see a woman in a boat this piece was separate in the dirt in front here, but probably is the face of the woman here standing in the boat. And that's, this picture is on this wall. This had a sort of tabernacle with a sort of curtains on either side with angels holding them back, but the design was less well preserved. Here we couldn't find the design at all. Now here you have the church, the assembly hall, the prison, and I'll show you that in a minute, of what was once the mosque, and some open areas, and what we think was the main street between the large fortified citadel and the drawbridge citadel over here, the Ceuta Gate. And right in the middle of that was a smaller church. So you had a large church, which records say is Misericordia. And this church, we actually found, unfortunately, terribly beaten up, a clay sculpture, probably with, and there's a hair, but probably a cap sewn on to the, painted over, probably in one of the local saints of this church and chapel. Here's this was in the dirt. It had been on the second story wall of this building, which we think was an elite house of rich people, and it said Moni Colombo. Two family names probably occupied this building, and this is a window frame, very elaborately decorated. What I'm about to suggest is a major difference between the Muslim and the Portuguese site. The Muslim streets were largely dirt. The houses were elaborately decorated inside, had their own indoor plumbing and well and toilet and so forth. The Portuguese houses were very plain inside, not decorated. They were decorated outside on the street, door jambs, window coverings. The streets, the main streets, were all cobbled, elaborately cobbled with great energy. We didn't find indoor toilets. We found chamber pots instead in Portuguese buildings. There's a real reversal. The public is what mattered. The private was very plain. This is the former hammam. As we first excavated, where all the doorways had been cemented shut with large boulders, and there was a fallen roof in the middle chamber, which we think was actually used as a prison. And here they're excavating things found in the room when the site was abandoned. Here's just to give you an idea of residential buildings. Here's a drawing of a little plaza. The Islamic house itself was centered around this courtyard and would have come out to here, and the well and the fountain would have been inside the house. The Portuguese pushed back the wall, creating a plaza, making the well available to people on the street, not privately, and then made this quite elaborate street pattern for, this is not the main plaza, just a secondary plaza with lines of stones going, designing, other stones filling in. There happened to be an oven here and a grinding stone right here. This pattern is visible in the opposite direction right here. Portuguese pottery, quite different. Some of it probably coming from Muslim traders like this pot. Some of it coming almost certainly from Spain, Majolica. Fancier, reflective, more faience, ware that we think is from Valencia. These we think are from Seville. Perhaps Portugal itself, Spain. This vessel is certainly from Italy. There's glass vessels that are certainly not from Sarcir itself. We don't expect there's a glass factory there as well. Copper keys, pendants that are not too much unlike the Arab ones. These, in fact, I have in the same photo as I did in the earlier design, may have been used either in Islamic or Portuguese times. These keys, though, certainly are of Portuguese vintage. This is a well-identified Italian-made ceramic from a place called Faenza in northern Italy. This is well known as was made in Genoa. This in Seville, as we had mentioned. We have 50 pieces of Oriental porcelains that may have come from Macau, which was the Portuguese colony of the 16th century. I don't have any visible here, but they're quite obviously evidence that even though this was a fort in a small colony, it had maritime access to the broader Mediterranean, had lots of supplies from overseas, and was part of a major global trading network as well. So let me wrap this up, and then we'll open it up for questions. A number of broad things were of interest to us. And what I found fascinating is I did this work in the 1970s and early 1980s. My own thinking has changed a great deal in what interests me. And so the major issue that we pursued when we were excavating Qsar Es-Seghir is to find what the town was made of, the institutions, the nature of the houses, and then to contrast these two towns, the Muslim town of the 12th through 15th century and the Portuguese colony of the 15th and 16th century. And so there were a number of things that became very obvious. One is this different use of public versus private space, and that the public space in the Muslim city was definitely indoor institutional space, the hammam, the mosque, the market area, and in a residential sense, it was held very privately. The decoration, access to water, all of these things were really part of your household itself, not part of the public plaza. This turns 180 degrees during the Portuguese period, that access to water and so forth is outside. The emphasis on decoration is outside your home, not inside your home. So there's a real difference between outside and inside in its use between the two periods. There's an obvious difference that I begin to mention, but wouldn't get into detail, in the evolution of fortifications between the 12th century and the 15th century, and the dominance of cannon fire and so forth to redesigning fortifications. Now, the other thing, and I think I would have looked at it much differently if I were working at Qsar Es-Seghir today, and that is, what is the connection? Where is this? We see it very much as focused on the Maghrib itself. In the Islamic period, it's clearly the bridge between Spain and Morocco. The boat bridge, as it were, not a physical bridge, but it was constructed, maintained, had its importance because of the interaction that went in. So in some very interesting ways, it was at the center of the Maghrib, at least when Iberia was under Muslim control. And so only in the last period, in the 13th and 1400s, when it was called Qsar Es-Seghir and was a sort of trading entrepot, did we really see it as being on the boundary where we think of it today. It's the boundary of Africa. But in fact, what I'd rather think of it, if I were doing this again, is at the center of an empire, and that it implied activity that was more holistic during the unified period. What's interesting to me is the emergence of this container port is taking a very, it's putting Qsar Es-Seghir in a different place again, in a sort of stepping off point, but it isn't Spain that we're talking about anymore. We're talking about stepping off for shipping to Cairo in the Middle East, and shipping to England and to Africa and South America and all places farther afield. And that very much reflects probably more the activity of the Portuguese period, when it was part of a very brief but important global empire that had colonies in East Asia and colonies in South America, and throughout the Atlantic and around the African coast. And maybe we're having a reemergence of the importance of this location in terms of all those degrees. This is actually a crew from another year, from other one was 1977. This is 1978, and we're located in the Ceuta Gate, the fortified gate. We've yet to excavate. We've excavated the trough on the plaza, but we haven't excavated the drawbridge area and the actual enclosure yet, which we did in 1980. And you can see once again a crew of about 50 local workers and a large number. That's me, by the way, with a lot more hair than I have today, and a mix of both Europeans, Americans, Moroccans, and then local Moroccans and Berbers and so forth. Okay, I think we're done. I'll leave this here and stop sharing. I think, Salah, you were going